Surely it's not the role of government to be making prescriptive lists of what you, I, or anyone else should be buying, because what's essential to you, what's essential to me, or what's non-essential to another person, there's a complete debate to be had about how you prioritize goods. And this emphasizes how we're looking at what used to happen in Eastern Europe, another sort of communist socialist state, where we were told that A wasn't necessity for life, B wasn't necessity for life, but C was and D is. And so these lists were created and the public had to subscribe to them. And that's what Welsh Government put their energy into at the end of last week, was creating lists that said you couldn't go out and buy baby clothes.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by the former leader of the Welsh Conservatives, Andrew R.T. Davies MS, the member for South Wales Central. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for extending the invite, Darren. It's a pleasure to be on here.
Now, Andrew, Wales is now under the toughest coronavirus restrictions in Europe, and the Labour-led Welsh Government reckons that this is a temporary 17-day firebreak lockdown. Do you have any real confidence that it'll all be over in 17 days' time?
Well, the First Minister himself, Mark Drakeford, doesn't have any confidence in that outcome because when you ask him what's going to happen after November the 9th, he says he doesn't know. And one of his deputy ministers was doing the media rounds on the weekend, and they're already talking of a third national lockdown here in Wales at the end of January or beginning of February. It is a fact that they've allowed it to get out of control. It is a fact that they put many measures in place and haven't enforced those measures prior to this national lockdown. And that's why we're in the situation we're in at the moment.
Now, if we look at the infection rate in Wales, I believe, at least it was when I last checked, that it's lower than it is in England. And I'm wondering, do you believe that this is a proportionate response from the Welsh Government?
No, as Welsh Conservatives, we voted against the national lockdown, as did most of the centre-right type politicians in the Assembly or Welsh Parliament, call it what you will, last week when we had a vote on this. Admittedly, we only had the vote after the First Minister announced it. Talk about power going to the head. It's quite unbelievable to see the way the Welsh Labour government are responding to a lot of things at the moment. But I don't think it's proportionate. And in particular, when you look at the scientific advice that the Welsh government were basing their argument on, Sage back in September, when they presented that to both governments, the UK and the Welsh government, said the effectiveness and the outcomes, the evidence that was based on, was very weak. Now, if you had weak evidence, you wouldn't go and shut a whole economy down and a whole country down. You would look at what you were doing, and the arguments that we've put forward is using local data, identifying the hotspots, bearing down on the hotspots without damaging the rest of the country. And the Welsh Government have refused to do that time and time again.
And I mean, when Wales imposed a travel ban on travellers from English coronavirus hotspots, Mr. Drakeford said that the restrictions would be stricter under the new lockdown rules. Now, I've no idea what those actually are, but I am worried that the Welsh Government actually risk damage and support for the union through these measures. It actually makes it a sort of us and them approach when actually we are one country.
Well, again, it's Mark Drakeford playing to the nationalist card here, and it was interesting to see how he's been led by the nose by Plaid Cymru, the Welsh nationalists, on this particular issue. When again, the scientific evidence said that it was minimal transmission rates when it came to transport affecting the virus here in Wales. Most of the virus spreading in Wales was community transmission, and that's where the efforts needed to be concentrated on. But this was a typical Welsh nationalist approach to try and weaken the union, make a case for separation, and the Welsh Labour government were quite happy to be led down that path. Because a lot of your listeners and viewers will have to bear in mind that next May, as things stand, we still have a Welsh general election slated here for May the 6th. And so obviously Drakeford is looking at potential coalition partners after that election if he were to be in a position to form a government. But after the shenanigans over the last weekend, I would say that the confidence of the public in him has been greatly shaken here in Wales.
Mm-hmm. Well, I hope so. I mean, to be honest with you, I've not seen anything quite like the backlash over the non-essential items ban. And, the sort of uproar about that by, I think, everyone in all four constituent parts of the United Kingdom, but especially Wales, has been quite immense, actually. And people are just asking similar questions to yourself, which is, where is the evidence for this?
Well, that's the simple argument here. I mean, we start from the premise we don't support the national lockdown, and we've exampled that by voting against it. So it's not a case of populism where we've come late to the party. We voted against it. We've spoken against the national lockdown. Now, the argument that he's deployed is saying that, well, if we're shutting down high street retailers, it's not fair that supermarkets and out-of-town stores are able to sell goods. Now, our point is, it's not fair to shut down retailers on the evidence that you have. But accepting there's a national lockdown, surely it's not the role of government to be making prescriptive lists of what you, I, or anyone else should be buying. Because what's essential to you, what's essential to me, or what's non-essential to another person, there's a complete debate to be had about how you prioritise goods. And this emphasises how we're looking at what used to happen in Eastern Europe, another sort of communist socialist state, where we were told that A wasn't necessity for life, B wasn't necessity for life, but C was and D is. And so these lists were created and the public had to subscribe to them. And that's what Welsh Government put their energy into at the end of last week, was creating lists that said you couldn't go out and buy baby clothes. You couldn't go out and buy all sorts of manner of goods that you would think are important in everyday lives, yet you could go out and buy a bottle of vodka. Now, come on, let's get real here. Government's energy needs to be focused on bearing down on the virus. It needs to be focused on hospital-acquired infections, and it needs to be focused on increasing capacity where that's required in the health service. Not trying to stop people who are out getting the necessities of life in the local supermarket and then having plastic stuck all around those goods to stop people buying them. That is a state which is overreaching itself and a government that has lost sense of perspective in this argument.
I mean, on Tesco's Twitter account this morning, they've issued an apology arguing that they've been told not to sell non-essential items, which is, of course, the law for the duration of the firebreak lockdown. Now, you might be thinking, okay, well, televisions and microwaves, all right, baby clothes maybe at a push. But when you hear the words non and essential, and the item in question here was sanitary towels, I'm pretty sure they are essential. You know, what the hell is going on there? I should clarify that the Welsh Government spokesman has actually hit back just before we started recording, saying that this is wrong. Period products are essential. Supermarkets can still sell items that can be sold in pharmacies. But come on, when you've got Welsh people being told that they can't buy period products, clearly something's gone quite wrong in the government messaging here, hasn't it?
Well, clearly, because there was a lady who tweeted out of her experience when she went to purchase her sanitary products and she was stopped from buying those sanitary products. That's an experience you can't write out of the equation. It actually happened to someone, and most probably to many others. Now, we can get a clarification of the rules, we can get a retraction of maybe a tweet that was put out by a company, but it is a fact that people have gone through that very experience here in Wales. And for goodness sake, we're supposed to live in a Western democracy, and that's what's going on here today in Wales. And the damage it's doing to Wales's reputation as a country that's open, welcoming in normal circumstances, in 6, 12, 18 months' time, when hopefully all this is blown through, people will, when you say you come from Wales, weren't you that country that stopped people buying baby clothes? Weren't you that country that stopped you buying a kettle? Or weren't you that country who stopped buying a TV? And I take issue maybe with the point that you said you could argue that maybe a TV isn't important or a kettle's not important. Actually, what we do know from the pandemic is that mental health has been hugely affected by people's pressures, whether it be in a lockdown situation or just the insecurity of a job. And if we're half-term week, which it is here in Wales, and another week after that the kids are home, if the TV does pack up, which maybe is a centre of attention in that family, or maybe just even purchasing a board game, that could relieve the tension within that household. Now, who am I to say to someone that that's not important in your household? I mean, it is an ideological argument because as a Conservative, I don't believe the state should be prescriptive. The state has a role, and it has a role to support people in their everyday lives. It hasn't got a role to be prescriptive in what is essential in one person's life or one family's life over another person's life or another family's life. And that, to me, is massive, massive overreach of the state. And importantly, what it does as well, it knocks the confidence of people when politicians are telling them to do things for the virus to suppress it. And if you don't take people with you, politicians like myself or Labour politicians sitting in Parliament in Cardiff Bay or indeed Parliament in Westminster can pass all the laws, all the regulations they want. But if people don't buy into them, they're unenforceable at the end of the day. And that's what's going to play out here if the government in Wales isn't careful.
I agree with that. I mean, I spoke recently with Mark Reckless, MS, who's defected from the Brexit Party to the Abolish Party. What are your thoughts on abolishing the Welsh Assembly? Of course, you would lose your job, but do you think it's a campaign that could actually see popular support in Wales?
Well, I take great pride and pride in obviously representing people of South Wales Central in the Welsh Parliament. But if I lost my job, I lost my job. The electorate will determine that next May anyway. They will then. I'm a farmer by background. I didn't go into politics till I was in my late 30s, to be honest with you. So it's not something that has been my career since I didn't go to university. I went to the School of Hard Knocks, to be honest with you. But, I've got a life which I can go to. But what I'd say to people is this, that it's easy to strapline abolish the Welsh Assembly or the Welsh Parliament. The reality is that we live in a country that has a Parliament in Scotland, has an executive and a Parliament or stroke Assembly in Northern Ireland, has mayors and devolved governments of some shape or form across the United Kingdom. Are we seriously saying that the direction of travel is going to be to scrap the Assembly or scrap the Welsh Parliament here in Wales and take everything back to Westminster, when we as Conservatives believe in, devolving responsibility, devolving competence to the lowest common denominator, which is the citizen themselves? And so I believe that there's a place for devolution, there's a place for the Welsh Parliament. I agree entirely that we've got to get rid of this awful Labour government that's been running Wales for the last 20 years. And they've had a democratic mandate to do that. They've turned out at election time and they've won a majority, well, not necessarily a majority, but they formed coalitions after each election. And what we need to focus on next May the 6th is to make sure that the people who vote centre-right in Wales turn out and vote for the Welsh Conservatives. Because if we capture 75% of the vote that we got in the last general election, on past form, that would be big enough to form a government here in Wales that would be led by the Welsh Conservatives. So I respect Mark. I have a huge amount of respect for Mark. And in fact, I was the leader when Mark came over and started to vote with the Conservative whip in the Assembly some 2 or 3 years ago, much to the grind of many of my Conservative colleagues. And I can well remember taking quite a few abusive phone calls over it from senior colleagues. But at the end of the day, I took the view that was for us to decide in the Welsh Assembly how we cast our block of votes. And to me, it's about making sure the strongest centre-right vote possible is put into the Welsh Parliament. If we fracture that centre-right vote, then ultimately you will have perpetual centre-left voting or left-wing voting here, because Plaid Cymru, the Liberals and Labour will just align themselves and will continue to see the economic decline, the social decline and the well-being of Wales continue to decline as it has done for 20 years. So rather long answer, but I respect their ability to go out and campaign if that's what they wish to do. But to me, it's critical to hold the centre-right vote together, go to the ballot box and vote for change and put a Welsh government in place that's led by the Welsh Conservatives. Because the rest of the United Kingdom has a form of devolved government in some shape or form. And it's pretty much unthinkable to think that Wales would not have a government that was determining matters in Wales itself, as well as having strong unionist credentials.
Well, speaking of strong unionist credentials, and just to end as well, I wonder if you believe that the different approaches in each of our four nations could actually be turning us against each other. I've definitely heard from a lot of people, and this is well documented in the Telegraph by one of their travel editors, that there is a lot of abuse actually directed towards English people who are visiting sites of natural beauty in Wales, which of course Wales is renowned for. That's one of the parts of its rich tapestry, right? Is that it does have these areas of real beauty. And I think it's a good thing that English, Scottish, Northern Irish people want to go to Wales and boost the coffers of the Welsh economy and Welsh tourism. Are you worried for the future of the union by people being turned off by what are, I guess, the more nasty elements of nationalism, essentially?
Well, I'm a passionate unionist. At every opportunity, I promote my unionist credentials. I went into politics to strengthen what I personally believe is the strongest and greatest union that the world has seen, culturally, economically, or socially. It binds these islands together. But what devolution has done is create a platform for nationalists in Scotland, for example, here in Wales with Plaid Cymru, but in particular in Wales, they do overreach themselves because many commentators from London, for example, try and read SNP, Plaid Cymru together. Now, the reality is the Nationalists are but a small rump in Wales, and I accept unless we make a positive case for the Union, and the pandemic has been a positive case with the resources of the Union being harnessed to protect people's jobs, protect the welfare state, protect the economic vibrancy of this country. And we've got to make sure that we emphasise time and time again the strength and bonds that unite these islands together under one union flag, whilst respecting what proud, passionate Welsh men and women like myself believe is great about being Welsh. And I'm sure what you think is great about being English and what is great about being Scottish or great about being Northern Irish. That shouldn't make you an insular figure. That should make you a more positive figure, that you're prepared to recognise the bonds of the Union is what runs through the veins of these islands, whilst respecting and appreciating what is locally good and strong for you in your part of the United Kingdom. And I just don't think we make that argument strong enough and compelling enough and with enough passion. And so I've always committed myself to making sure that whenever I'm out, I'm promoting what the Union can do for my part of Wales, and in particular the wider areas of Wales that you just identified, Darren, are so attractive, are so appealing, and are open and welcoming in normal circumstances. And that's what the Nationalists want people to fall into the trap of, is turning the English against the Welsh against the English, or the Scots against the English, and vice versa. We must never, ever allow that to succeed, because if we do, we hand the keys to breaking our union up to them. And I hope to God, as a father of 4 people, that the union that I will see through will be a stronger union for my kids and the next generation to come through and protect and appreciate. Because one thing I come to understand is through this pandemic, it's the blood that flows through the unionist veins that have kept this country moving forward. We can argue about the political mistakes, and that's the nature of politics and democracy, but it's the strength of the union that has kept us in a safe harbour, sheltering away from the gales and the storms of this pandemic.
I mean, beautifully put. I personally believe, as someone from the northeast of England, that I've got more in common with many Welsh people than I do with people in the south of England. The idea that we are not one country it just boggles belief for me personally. So hopefully people like you are going to keep on keeping on and beating that unionist drum.
Well, I had a lot more hair and I was a lot darker as well when I went into politics. So one thing I can say about politics, however much you beat the drum, it don't do much for the looks. Not that I had much looks beforehand. But as I said earlier, it's a huge privilege and I have passion galore for it, even after 13 years of being in the Welsh Parliament. I look forward to the Welsh general election next May, but what we've got to do is make sure at the moment we hold this Welsh Labour government to account, and their cronies, the Welsh Nationalists and the Liberals, because what they're doing to Wales is absolutely unspeakable, and the harm that they will do to the image and understanding that people have of Wales will be intolerable if they're allowed to carry on with some of these mad hat ideas that they're bringing forward, such as the shopping experience that we've seen over the weekend. We all want to beat the virus. We all want to keep people safe and secure. But what we can't allow is government to be run by media and diktat, because that will be the slippery slope to oblivion.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining Reasoned.
No problem at all, Darren. It's a pleasure to come on, and thank you for inviting us on.